Thank you so much for joining us for our Literary Arts Lab this weekend, and of course for coming tonight for our Deadman Writer-in-Residence, Jennifer Croft. My name is Vu Tran. I teach fiction writing here at the program in creative writing, and we're grateful, by the way, as always, to Jonathan Deadman, who's been generously helping us bring some of the most renowned writers of fiction and nonfiction here to UChicago for so many years. And we really appreciate his genuine love for the literary arts. Now, one of the more satisfying aspects of being a writer in the world for me is seeing people I know and already admire not only become very successful in their work, but also seeing how unexpectedly and profoundly they reveal themselves through that work. And of course, one of the distinct privileges of teaching at a university is that you can be part of inviting them to events like this one, where you can also show off that they're a friend of yours. The thing is, I didn't really get to know Jenny until about 8 years ago. Even though we knew each other and our paths kept crossing for the first few decades of our lives. We both grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, around the same area of town. And we both attended college at the University of Tulsa, though she started there at 15. And I think I met you when you were 17 or something like that.
No, I just remember you were a senior and you were too cool for me to talk to.
Oh, no. Now you were bumping. Yes. Soon after that, we both ended up at the University of Iowa around the same time again to get our MFAs, mine in fiction writing, hers in literary translation. And then she also spent a number of years here in Chicago getting her PhD at Northwestern. And after that, that's where our timelines just totally diverged. And she went on, took over the world, living and traveling everywhere from Buenos Aires to Poland to Berlin to Paris. Every now and then, I'd be emailing her, and she'd be living or staying in yet another far-flung country. It was always so astounding and amazing to me. You might know her best, or first, as a translator of Polish, Ukrainian, Russian, and Argentine Spanish fiction. You might also know that she was nominated for the National Book Award and won the 2018 Man Booker International Prize alongside Olga Tokarczuk for her translation of the novel Flights, which I think is fair to say that truly brought Tokarczuk to the full attention of American and international readers and had an impact on her winning the Nobel Prize the very next year. Croft also translated the author's 900-page magnum opus, The Books of Jacob, which was again shortlisted for the Man Booker last year. Now, I have no expertise in translation, but I've always imagined that truly exceptional translation work requires not only deep knowledge of at least 2 languages, the text, and the artistry of that text's author, but that it also requires a depth of artistry from the translator. This well of creativity and personal vision that goes hand in hand with interpreting someone else's words. So it shouldn't be surprising that Croft is herself an exceptionally gifted writer. We'll chat a bit about her brilliant memoir, Homesick, which I think is a uniquely moving synthesis of her personal and emotional life and her intellectual and professional and aesthetic life. Homesick won the prestigious William Saroyan International Prize for Writing in 2020. And she actually first wrote it as an autobiographical novel in Spanish and published it in 2014. And soon now, I don't know quite when, but she'll be publishing her very first novel in English, Amadou, which is another wholly different act of intriguing synthesis. The novel won her at Guggenheim last year, and you'll hear from it tonight. She is also a founding editor of the Buenos Aires Review, and among her numerous other honors are the Coleman, Fulbright, NEA, and Penn Fellowships, and the inaugural Michael Henry Heim Prize for Translation. And her other writing and translations have also been published everywhere from the New York Times to Granta to The Guardian. Last thing I'll say is I always feel a little presumptuous saying I'm proud of anyone, unless they're a student or a sibling of mine. But you do feel a unique and incredible pride when someone shares similar aspects of your background, and they not only succeed at their profession, but more importantly, I think, succeed at bringing to life this long-held artistic devotion that you yourself have always also shared. So anyway, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome Jennifer Croft here tonight.
That was by far the loveliest introduction I've ever gotten. And we're basically siblings, so please tell me you're proud of me whenever you feel like it. I'm pretty discombobulated because I had twins 5 months ago, and this is like the first time that I've left the house for an extended period. I don't remember how to get dressed anymore, but in the elevator, a parent undergrads complimented me on my outfit. So I feel totally reborn and like a real professional now, despite the glasses. All right, so this novel is about translators who worship a very famous Polish author who lives in the primeval forest between Poland and Belarus. And they are really excited to be translating her magnum opus at the beginning of the novel, which is what I'm going to read. And it is called Amadou, and I'm happy to talk about the title afterwards if you're interested. But for now, I'll just start reading. Amadou. We worshipped our author, and when she sent us an email telling us her masterpiece was done, we canceled our plans, unpacked our bags, and flew from our cities to Warsaw, where, bedraggled and ecstatic, we took the train into town and boarded the bus for Białowieża. It was our 7th pilgrimage to the village at the edge of the primeval forest where she lived. She had always lived there, 5 miles from the Belarusian border. She loved that forest as much as we loved her books, which, without a fraction of a second's hesitation, we would have laid down our lives to defend. We treated her every word as sacred, even though our whole task was to replace her every word. We arrived on August 7th, 2017. It was a full moon, and that onrush of light transformed her slim, sinuous home, converting the oak strips on the convex walls into quicksilver that momentarily held the frenzied shadows of the forest, slickening their inextricable shapes, and then engulfed them. There were 8 of us. Swedish was new, handsome as a red deer, and we knew at first sight that he would be her favorite. Not only because of the prestige of his language, a conduit to her inevitable Nobel Prize, but also because of his saunter, his stance, that gratifying invitation in his hot blue eyes. Because somehow, that evening, our author's unshakable husband Bogdan, whose lust worked like kerosene on her authorial imagination, wasn't there. With him gone, she was different than we'd ever seen her. She was as ghost-white as the moon. Her eyes were black holes, and it hurt to look into them directly, like we were being torn apart. So we kept our eyes on her crossed arms, but even her arms weren't her arms anymore, exactly, more like twigs half inhumed by her too heavy sludge-colored dress. Her neck lacked the onyx amulet she'd been given by her grandfather, the local black magician. Without it, her collarbone jutted out like it wanted to break. She didn't say much. She said nothing about Bogdan. We chalked up all these departures to the toll of finishing a magnum opus. We felt certain we could help her, not only because of Swedish, but because we always had. Now we'd have to. Besides Bogdan, we were the only ones she truly trusted. If he was gone, that meant that all she had was us. That night we simply tried not to tax her. Soon we adjourned to our usual rooms, while Swedish stayed downstairs with her. We assumed she would put him in Czech's former place in the shed in the backyard. Perhaps, if she had, there would have been no fire, no Tempelhof, no old revolvers. But back then we were still in possession of our great invisible luxury, never questioning her choices, transmuting the form without so much as touching the substance. Or so we believed. Her staircase was a spiral of oak that dawn brought back to life. The 3rd step up had a knot that brought good luck. We held many superstitions, which we'd teach Swedish in the coming months. We'd learn in turn that he had expert knowledge of much of what was hidden in the forest, underground networks, electric, that we never even knew were there, although we'd always belonged to them. On the third floor, Serbian and Slovenian shared the bedroom with the slanted ceiling and the skylight, 2 twin beds, and the balcony overlooking Belarus. English occupied the second floor suite with the sleek tiled stove and private shower, a glass case in the middle of the room. German got the cot in the winter garden, where he'd sleep under the Czech chandelier and frail upside-down constellations, surrounded by prayer plants and ferns. The Czech chandelier was made of 10 little skulls and too many bones for us to count. The whole house was filled with storied objects, dark portraits of her ancestors in scalloped gilded frames, low alabaster tables, a Bosdigan mace, a piano, massive chests with cavernous keyholes, a solid bronze candelabra 3 feet high with 9 tendriling, gravity-defying arms. When we were translating, which we did every day except for Sunday, we worked at a table for 10 on the 3rd floor. We took all meals together at an identical table downstairs. When we had time to socialize, we did so in the other downstairs room, the one with the lotto-like carpet, thick and blood red, with indecipherable black and white calligraphy. Atop the carpet were a mustard chaise longue and a ring of 7 barrel chairs, bedecked by Bogdan in the orange and pink and blue Punjabi patterns from our author's 2007 world tour. That was the room with the fireplace, where we'd later erect her shrine. Her home stood in the village's center, surrounded by red glowing currants, a gigantic stork's nest on its roof. We had always wondered, since storks were symbols of fertility, why our author and Bogdan had never had kids. But we put it down to the demands of stitching up the world's wounds with language, which left no time for further caretaking. That night, our sleep was heavy, and when she roused us in the morning at 4, our dark march toward the strict reserve bled back into our dreams. We all had the feeling we'd forgotten something as we passed through an expanse of weeds that reached up to our knees, though leaving behind things was our profession. The birds at that hour were deafening, mustering the forces of the sun. Rumpled from our journeys, our clothes soaked up the dew. The strict reserve was the most protected part of Białowieża, off-limits to the public, although nothing was off-limits to Irina Ray. At its entrance, she turned and pressed her trigger finger to her mouth. Then we all turned in silence to look out over the field. A pale halo on the horizon revealed Pine Islands, pinkish, awash in a web of fog. The field was filled with tiny starry flowers. We stood stock still. Later, on the morning of the duel, as elk and white ermine surveyed their changed surroundings, that same field would grow vociferous, but for now it responded to our quiet and kind, and returned again, satisfied no one was following, and went in. She'd been convoking us here on the periphery of Poland since 2006, the year she published her 3rd book. A hit in the original, Lena soon gave rise to translations, first into German, then into Czech. That was how we were born, from the foam of a novel called Lena. For the first time since she dropped out of college in Krakow after only a couple of weeks, our author started to circulate outside her native voivodeship. She was 28 years old. And chanting at festivals, at conferences, at readings, she was often compared to a żar-ptak, the luminous peacock-like creature of Proto-Slavic myth that offered hope to the beleaguered and guidance to the lost. Many people tried to describe her indescribable aura. Some said it was like fine filaments of strummed silver that hovered over her dark, cascading hair. Some said it was like the southern lights, brilliant streaks that hissed across her deep sky eyes. Some said her fingers were like holy spinnerets, that her every nimble gesture was an act of brilliant, captivating love. Irina Ray became a household name, but the more households she entered, the more rumors arose. Some people said she stole her ideas from an obscure Kashubian philosopher, others from Wikipedia and Bogdan. Some said her mother was Lena's real author, and it wasn't until much later that we realized how cruel this rumor was. Her first book, Wilderness, interconnected stories about the guards at Krakow's Czartoryski Museum, had sold so few copies when it came out in 2000 that almost no trace of it remained. Just a low-res image from the archive section of the publisher's website. Its cover depicted flames that were devouring a portrait of a woman, likely Da Vinci's Lady with Ermine, the most renowned object in that eccentric Polish collection, which also included mummies and an armory until unsolved thefts at the turn of the century forced the folding of those wings. Published by a different house, her next book, Isolation, from 2004, about a woman who spends 3 months in the Kletno bear cave on the border between Poland and the Czech Republic, a timely parable that should have shed light on EU accession, did not fare better. Then she got married, changed the spelling of her last name from the semi-Polish R-E-J to the more international R-E-Y, wrote an action-packed, heart-wrenching tale of an Albanian girl named Lena trafficked to London, whose desperate quest for freedom was hailed by critics as both blisteringly real and chillingly allegorical, and suddenly everything changed. A movie was made, and the movie made a fortune. It had everything: sex, guns, scenery, and even more importantly, Irina looked and sounded fabulous promoting it on TV. That was when she built the tallest house in Białowieża. She commissioned an architect from Yokohama to create a home in perfect harmony not with the village, but with the forest, and the result was a Jigoku Gumi wonder, a 3-story masterpiece of undulating, unscathed oak. It was alive, and it made you feel more alive just to look at it, let alone reside in it. She never said it in so many words, but we always knew her house had been designed for us, for our work together, as a family. The reduction of that wonder to rubble and ash, ineluctable in hindsight, was inconceivable that morning as she led us down a curving path deeper into the forest. On either side of us were stinging nettles, a couple of feet deep. Past that, slender trunks that bowed under the weight of their fresh foliage. Some of the older trees were fallen, spiked, half covered by mosses, lichens, slime molds in pale pink and neon yellow. Suddenly, the tallest trees started to crackle and lick. We felt no wind. Down where we were, besides the tits and woodpeckers, there was only the quiet drone of tiny insects always on the verge of getting stuck in our eyes. We were ceaselessly swatting at mosquitoes. Being in the forest, just like being with our author, meant always being on our guard. In the wake of Lena, especially the movie version, trolls went after our author's every word. Her next book, 2007's Kernel of Light, told the story of a non-binary scientist who tries to steer clear of corruption at a research station in Antarctica, where symbiotic communities of fruticose lichens, already taxed by climate change, are being stripped for pharmaceutical research. By this time, everyone either hated or adored our author. There was no in-between. Kernel of Light prompted tens of thousands of death threats, rape threats, and threats of deportation. It also got her nominated for every literary prize in existence. With the money from the ones she won, she finished furnishing her house, our summiting place, and created a communal account for us to use to pay for flights and trains and bus fare. To Czech and German were added English, Serbian, Spanish, and French. We came now to a fork marked by a ragged stump. In Polish, these vegetable wrecks are known as złoms. They are created by rime, the frost formed by fog, or by very strong winds, or by hail. The word złom can also mean an old car no one wants, one bound for the scrap heap, or any useless piece of junk, like a washing machine that won't work or a hefty home phone. It is related to the word załamanie, meaning fracture, crash, collapse. A person who is załamana is psychically broken, like Irina Ray, who stood by the stump as though trying to decide how to proceed. Stress shot through our bodies and made our extremities ache. She'd never hesitated in the past, especially not on an opening day, and she had certainly never gotten lost or confused in her own forest. Then she went left, and we passed through a swamp we knew well, our footsteps resounding on the primitive bridge, unleashing fluttering, splashing, scampering that shook the primordial ferns. We took deep breaths and were soothed by the scent of urine and stinkhorns and rot. If you take away the M, złom becomes zło, the Polish word for bad or evil, which would start to feel more apt to us over the coming months when we'd happen on these rough-hewn ruins in new moons, praying we would find her, leaving no snail, no stone, no scarlet elf cup unturned. We'd come to understand the forest wasn't a place that could be searched like any other place. It was a million unconnected events in the process of connecting, some advancing in time, some going backward. It was as many unentanglings, unpredictable and unstoppable. It was all time condensed into a moment at once so fleeting and so unfathomably vast that if a person wished to disappear in it, there would never be anything anyone could do to recover her. She would simply be gone. Unless, of course, she'd never been there in the first place. But none of that occurred to us that day. We were book people. We had yet to truly concern ourselves with earth. We came at last to a little clearing, and our author positioned herself in front of a massive ancient oak. Our eyes moved from grass, dirt, and our feet to her feet, and from there up the scant remnants of our author's body, past her caved-in face, entering the crevices and ridges that formed the bark's great maze, up and up and up and up, 70 feet to the beginning of its branches, which then shot out in all directions, swerving and spiking and exploding into leaves. Our author bent and rustled a bundle out of her small olive-green backpack. Then she straightened up and flicked her hair back and leaned against the tree and cleared her naked throat. "Shada eminencia," she said in a disconsolate gurgle, yet in our minds we invested her voice with our own vigor, made it pronounce this new title in our languages, eminence grise, siva eminenza, graue eminenz, gray eminence. But Irina didn't read. When we had translated Perfection, and then Matsura, and then Sedno I, the Saccharmasochists, Future Moonscapes of the Eocene, Sedno II, the Hopefuls, and Pompeii Catalog, we had kept to a certain routine. As we had taken our places around our table on the third floor of her home, Irina at its head, presiding, Bogdan had placed a spiral-bound copy of her new manuscript before each of us in turn, and pronounced a few discreet words of welcome, of praise, before leaving us alone together. First, she would divulge the title of her latest work. Then she would wait a little for the title to sink in, and we would marvel over it. Then she would read us the first paragraph, which ranged in length from just a couple of words with a semicolon in the case of Pompeii Catalog to 35 pages in the case of Perfection. She wanted us to translate fresh, uninfluenced by any reviews or propaganda we might read, whether for or against her. She refused to send her manuscripts to her editor, now at the largest publisher in Poland, until our translations had passed the halfway mark. This meant that our author did not write rough drafts, only final ones, and that gave her work an appealing unevenness, akin to the oak bark behind her that other literary figures' slicker co-productions lacked. On every previous occasion, after she had finished reading the first paragraph, our author would drink. Near her left hand, she always kept a glass of mineral water into which Bogdan would release 3 drops of some dark tincture before leaving us in the morning, a procedure he repeated at 4 in the afternoon. The tincture would sparkle and unfurl, a liquid galaxy, and we'd watch Bogdan watch it with reverence for 6 seconds, we silently counted, before he'd turn sharply toward the door and glide out of the room to clean or cook or garden, chores he performed with obsequious, lascivious joy, even making our beds despite our protests. But now there was no tincture, and there was no paragraph, and there would be no made beds, and the absence of a manuscript was a sudden precipice in the forest, as if a fault had yawned and would swallow us. With her thumb and forefinger, Irina made the slightest movement over the oddly shaped bundle she had extracted from her backpack, and the fabric that had covered it fell away, becoming a miniature tablecloth draped over her skeletal hand. Atop this broken table lay a severed hoof. The air in the clearing, formerly abundant, thinned. We held our breath. We scrutinized her object. It was hideous, deformed, and inexplicable. She said a word in her language, in our shared language, and our minds scrambled, fumbled, failed. We dedicated our lives to understanding her, but all of a sudden we didn't understand. She said another word, similar to the first one, something like hubik, something starting with hub, and then a phrase, but it wasn't a Polish phrase, and none of it made sense to us. Then she went on saying something about fire, but because we had panicked, we didn't see the connection, however unbelievable it seems to us now, given what came later, the pyre that sank into the snow, the loss of every line from her majestic library, how we took Białowieża's fate into our own hands, creating an ending that Irina never could have written, or wouldn't have. Unless, of course, she had. When she finally stopped talking, we all looked around, blinking back confusion. The sun was higher, a white light between the birches that arched and bared their lenticels, shimmering their leaves. The chill in the air had dissipated. The general cacophony had broken into hushes and occasional incontestable shrieks. Then in the distance, a brief roar became a rumbling, and to our utter bewilderment, our author strangled a sob. She knelt and rummaged around in her backpack. We tensed, praying she wouldn't reveal a horse's severed head. Instead, she took out 8 red velvet pouches, which she distributed to us. Each pouch featured a miniature version of the executioner's axe of her family's coat of arms, a familiar symbol that now whet our anxiety. When she had gone all the way around the circle, when all of us were holding our tiny axes that were embroidered in red thread, Irina moved to stand at our center and wait. We tugged at the pristine white cords until they gave. Inside we found lumps of a hard substance the color of sawdust. We looked up at our author, at her perfect profile, at her once lustrous hair, now scraggly, playing host to gray. She didn't offer any explanation. She bowed her head and shed 2 tears that crashed into the humus. And although we worshipped her, and although we rejoiced in the forest because it was her forest, we were overtaken then by terror. First, there was the fear that she would fire us, replace us with others who would understand her better than we had today, or maybe even better than we ever had. There were always new translators into English, into German, into French. There was no one who wouldn't want to work with Irina. Our replacements would be the easiest thing in the world to find. But then there was something worse, that there might not be any magnum opus, that the novel Grey Eminence might just be a hoof and some nuggets of compacted sawdust, and nothing more. This would mean the end of literature, maybe even of language, at least for the 8 of us. Just then, Swedish turned his back to her. All of us, including Irina, stared. He got down on one knee, making a fist over his red velvet pouch, and with his other hand he drew back some ferns to reveal a split elm lying rotting on the ground. We squinted. "Come," he said over his shoulder, smooth. "I can't believe it." There was a pleasant lilt to his Polish, but as a rule, we rarely ventured comments on anything other than our author in the presence of our author, and on opening days we didn't usually say anything at all. We glanced at Irina and saw she didn't know how to react. Her renewed hesitation made our toes curl inside our shoes. Somewhere in the middle distance, something snapped. She nodded us forward, but just when we were about to come close enough to see whatever it was he was enraptured by, Swedish looked up. He smiled at Irina, and we felt her thrill. He held her gaze for a beat, and then another, then reached out blindly for the cadaver of the elm. He leapt back with a gruff and provocative howl, dangling a snake from his free hand. It was enormous. From head to tail, it must have been 3 feet long, with links like black diamonds up and down its skin, and its belly was bulbous, like it had just finished innocently gorging itself on some innocent thing. We screamed and then were paralyzed. After what felt like an eternity, but must have been no more than a second or 2, the viper dropped, coiled with its head cocked back and its jaw still open, hissed, then shot off into the undergrowth. As one, we rushed to Swedish's side. We took him by the wrist. Someone said, "Let's go," and we all raced back through the forest the same way we'd come. Swedish kept saying he was fine, and it was true upon inspection that the 2 small points between his right thumb and forefinger barely even bled. But by the time we reached the meadow, large white discs had formed around them, and the back of his hand was swollen, and he told us it was tingling, and then it went numb, and by the time we reached the house, his fingers could no longer move. He doubled over in pain in the living room. 2 of us stood on either side of him and helped him to the chaise longue, where he reclined while we debated and savored his emergency proximity. Given the fate of his predecessor, we had every reason to fear for his life. Irina had disappeared into her room, and we were looking up clinics and cursing the village's cell service when she returned with a wicker basket of purplish flowers with spiny, ethereal centers and bright, floppy leaves. Now she knelt before Swedish and ordered us to bring her a bottle of sunflower oil, a large bowl, a pestle, and a dish towel. We flew off in all directions after her instructions. When we reassembled, we observed his whole forearm was swollen, all the way to his elbow, but that he and she were calmly conversing, so softly none of us could hear. She barely broke eye contact with him as she made her preparation, nor did she do so as she slid her glistening paste over his inflamed and gilded skin. "Does it hurt?" we finally heard her whisper, and in that moment, she was achingly beautiful, beautiful beyond belief. She was warmth, she was moisture, she was light, she was the adamant perfection of a million billion snowflakes in a split second's descent, and she was soft, and she was new, and she was eternal, and she was original, and she was love, and she was everything we wanted, all anyone could want in the world. And she was kneeling before him, and he bit his bottom lip and moaned a breathy, "Mmm." And yet, at this, Irina fled. We heard her lock her office door. A few minutes later, we heard a crash that was followed by a muffled yowl. We never meant her any harm. How could we have? All we wanted was to follow in her footsteps, making them our own. We were all in love with her. I was in love with her, too. Thank you.
That was great. I have questions for you about a lot of things about your memoir and about your, obviously, course translation. But let's talk first about the book. You mentioned the title. I mean, can you tell us a little bit about the title?
Yeah. So Amadou does anyone know what it is? It's this product that was once the dominant way of making fire for humans. Like for 10,000 years, people used Amadou as their tinder, so they would carry it around. So there's a famous man who was found in the Alps called Ötzi, the Iceman, which maybe you heard of. So he was like perfectly preserved by the ice for thousands of years, and he had Amadou with him to start fires. It's the product of a mushroom, and it looks like a horse's hoof. So I'm somewhat spoiling the early part of the book, but the severed hoof is not a severed hoof, it's actually a mushroom. And the thing about this mushroom is it starts out as a parasite on a tree, and it gradually kills the tree, but then it becomes a really useful thing. It becomes a decomposer, so it's helpful to the forest by recycling the material of the tree. And without fungi, it would be impossible for forests to kind of exist, basically, because nothing would decompose. So it's a kind of ambivalent figure, obviously a metaphor for translators, and there are other aspects to Amadou, but that's what I'll say for now.
But I think Irina is in there as well. I mean, I've only read this first chapter, so I mean, just the chapter by itself is so wonderfully intriguing and eerie and mythic, and you know I guess the fact that there is this there's translators and they're translating this larger-than-life author. I mean, I guess there's, one can be rightfully curious of the real-life parallels here. I hope you can speak to that, but I was immediately more curious of the kind of, I don't know, it's like this self-conscious, maybe ambivalent, maybe even satirical tone. And by that I mean the heightened nature of the style, the voice, the collective we. They're very worshipful, almost. I mean, they say it. This could be the end of language, the end of literature. Can you speak to that a bit? I mean, was there? I mean, I don't want to misread it either. If there was no satirical intention, but like, are you this self-consciously heightened tone? Is there a commentary there on the arts and on how we treat artists and literature or art in general?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in celebrity, especially in the arts. So you know, when we think of like every year, we all have to speculate about who's going to win the Nobel Prize. And it's always so silly, and it's often people we don't think should have won the Nobel Prize. But, you know, as soon as that is announced, we all rush out and buy all of the books we can find by Annie Ernaux. This translation summit thing is something that actually does happen. Apparently Murakami does these summits with his translators. I know his Polish translator, there's a really interesting documentary about this. They do not stay with him for the entirety of the translation process, but they do get together to kind of get on the same page before they get started. American bestsellers, US bestsellers, are sometimes translated by a number of people who have to stay in a bunker during the translation, so they have to surrender their phones. Have you heard about this?
I've heard with Margaret Atwood.
Oh, really?
She does something very similar. I'm sorry, I don't mean to.
No, that's great. I want you to tell me about that later.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just think it's such a maniacal, like, I can't imagine doing anything like that. And then in my own experience is a little bit different, but Olga Tokarczuk has now like 100 translators into all different languages, and that's, of course, steadily increased. But she has organized, well, now she organizes, there was just one a couple of months ago that I wasn't able to attend. Since she won the Nobel Prize and she got enough money to organize these things herself, she has been putting together Olga Tokarczuk conferences for her translators so everyone can get together. It's actually really helpful in some ways. Because now I'm friends with a lot of the translators, and even though we work with different languages, we're dealing with a lot of the same questions, and we can talk and we can find, difficult spots or mistakes even in the original, and kind of talk through together solutions for translating those things. But it is funny during those events how worshipful people are, and she's a very benevolent figure, unlike my character. But I did always think like this would be so much more fun if some of the translators were rivals, or if some of them were having affairs, or if some of them were plotting against the author. So in a way, the book was born out of that.
Mm. What I heard about Margaret Atwood is that every time she has a new manuscript, they go to somewhere in the woods, her editor, her agent, and someone else, and each one gets a different colored copy of the manuscript.
Wow.
Am I lying about this? Is there, did you feel like, I'm not familiar with your relationship with Olga, but like, did you find yourself catching yourself feeling a certain way about someone who you clearly admire, lionizing them in a way which might be deserved on some level, but in other ways unrealistic?
Yeah,
Did you find yourself feeling that way?
Well, she's a very charismatic person. She's a charismatic writer. She's a charismatic person. I think, I was for a while one of her younger translators, and I almost saw her as like a maternal figure. Like, also because I went into translation thinking that it was a kind of apprenticeship for writing. So I was like studying under Olga Tokarczuk since 2002. Long time, like from when I first started studying Polish. And, she definitely had like a certain, and I'm sure I just haven't seen her since the pandemic, but I'm sure she still has that, even on Zoom she has this effect. I think certain people just have this thing that's a little bit difficult to pinpoint, but she definitely has that.
Yeah, the mysteriousness of it is really the power of it. But I actually wanted to ask you about that because, as someone who teaches, I've always thought that I really don't understand a work until I teach it. You get to a level of certain intimacy with the work because you're poring over it and trying to, to sound smart in class to your students, basically. But like, I would imagine that a translator has so many more levels of intimacy, not just with the text, but with how they understand the author's worldview, their ideology. And, did you bring that in? Is there a kind of overlap with that level of intimacy to the level of intimacy that you have with you know, not only writing about your life, but writing about your own aesthetic vision of the world, you know. I imagine there became a lot of overlap there, and that you learned a lot, not just from her as a writer, but for yourself as expressing who you are.
Yeah, I think so. I think that intimacy also kind of cuts both ways, and there is a victim of my translation in the audience, so I don't want to say too much about it, but there's a kind of creepiness to translation, and I know there are other translators also in the audience, and I don't know if other people would agree with this, but that's something I put in the book. That maybe you've been translated, but there's this sense that the translator comes to know so much about your life and the way that you think about things and your obsessions in particular. So it's almost like seeing a therapist or something being translated. And yet you know nothing about the translator. Like, you don't know where they live, you don't know, like when they're translating your book, where are they sitting? Are they at a desk? Are they on a couch? Are they in their pajamas? Are they married? Do they have a cat? You know, you don't know any of that, but they know so many of those facts about you, even if it's, you know, Olga has written more or less autobiographical work. Flights has a lot of autobiography in it, and I know all about her divorce from that, and all kinds of other things about like her relationship with her parents and her sister, and I just think there's such an intensity to the translator's experience of a translation that, of course, the author can't share, and that was really interesting to me when I was thinking about this book too.
And I mean, how did that, or did it change how you? I mean, I imagine you were writing your own work all this time. How did that change your relationship, not just with your work, but with your own life and the way you thought about your own intimacy with yourself?
I mean, now I feel like I'm in therapy. That's a really good question. I'm sure it has. I mean, you know, that like Olga's worldview and philosophy have impacted my own worldview and philosophy, definitely. I mean, I think every author I've translated has very much. And I think, unlike some translators, I always just choose the books that I fall in love with. And there's something, you know, that draws me to a certain writer, a certain text at a certain time, you know, when I'm in need of whatever it is they are offering me. So I'm sure that there's a pretty strong and important emotional component.
Yeah. I mean, if we can wind back a little bit, because I think talking a little bit about your memoir and about your growing up in Tulsa, I think would inform how one reads this novel. I mean, especially for me, having only read the first chapter, but basically I want to talk about myself. I want to talk about how I knew you when, you know, I first met you at the University of Tulsa, I think it's about 27 years ago, and I was rereading your beautiful memoir yesterday, and first of all, rediscovering all these places that we grew up with, you know, the Drysdales, Western Wear, and Boot Barn, which is a lovely memory of your sister. How old was she? She's six, right? She bought these boots. My dad bought these boots that he loves. My dad had no sense of fashion. For whatever reason, he wanted these boots. My mom never wanted him to wear them, you know.
Why don't we have a picture of that up there?
God. But so I vividly remember him buying it at Drysdale's. But the Philbrook Museum, where we would all go to school field trips, the Metro Diner outside of University of Tulsa. But one of the things I'm curious about is how you think Tulsa shaped you as an artist, a thinker, a person in the world. You know, speaking of like worldview and how it's shaped by other people. But I mean, Tulsa, if you don't know, is a metropolitan city. It's by no means a small town. But some people would say or assume that that there's a certain narrowness or homogeneity of experience, whether it's culturally, demographically, politically, there, which I did feel growing up, but I don't always resent now, because in some ways I think it might have made me value even more the things that I ended up devoting myself to. And so I wonder how you see your upbringing in Tulsa either limiting or actually, revealing, cultivating, expanding your interests, especially when it comes to language, to traveling, to art.
Yeah, I mean, I would be saying something very different if we were sitting in Tulsa right now, but I think the boringness of Tulsa drove me to seek other places. I mean, not only the boringness is a humorous way of saying something that actually, like, really,
sure,
I felt alienated by. And if I had grown up in LA or New York or whatever, probably I wouldn't have felt that need to move to Warsaw or Buenos Aires or whatever. But I'm so glad that I did those things. So in the end, I guess it worked out, and now I've moved back to Tulsa as of this year. And I do think it has changed quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. It has, yeah.
We live in the arts district, which didn't exist when Boo and I were growing up. It was just empty warehouses, and now there's Magic City Books and all kinds of art galleries and a couple of museums. So I don't know. It seems like Tulsa is trying to be good.
Yeah. It is. I mean, it's great to see. I don't see it enough. But, you wrote your memoir when you were away from Tulsa, right?
Right.
I mean, that must be an experience to kind of come back now, having written about it, but also having rewritten it. I mean,
yeah.
How has your relationship with the memoir changed now that you're back?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I do feel like, to some extent, the memoir is a bit of a critique of Tulsa. And I remember when I started to write it that I really set out not to rewrite, like, the Wizard of Oz story, where, the goal is to go back home with a renewed appreciation of, like, I wrote it being very certain that I would stay in Buenos Aires forever. And I can't quite retrace my steps to figure out how that ended up not happening. And certainly don't know how I ended up back in Tulsa. But, I'm still resisting that narrative of ending up back where you started. I'm being really excited about it for myself. But I do think that it forces me to reconsider a little bit the plot of the book, in which this character who's based on me is completely liberated only through her escape from her hometown.
That's right. Yeah. I've wondered about that narrative for myself. But the memoir, if I can ask, I mean, it's a lot of it is about growing up in Tulsa with your younger sister, who developed a brain tumor at age 5 and lived with a lot of difficulties from that. I find it is deeply moving, formally innovative, I think exquisitely controlled piece of writing. But in this memoir, and I use that only because it's on this cover, you seem to be using all these tools at your disposal, which I see you doing it again in the novel. To wrestle, it seems to me, with how to tell the story. There's photography. You offer a kind of extra or parallel narrative in the captions of the photographs. You use the present tense instead of the past. You use the third instead of the first. You change your and your sister's name. And I know this was originally written as a novel. You even kind of offer these kind of headline sentences that introduce each section. All these elements, though, I think come together with this cohesive intimacy, I feel. And I can see many reasons for each, but I also have the sense of you recognizing that what you're doing is an act of unavoidable, imperfect interpretation, which of course makes me think of your translation work. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if that was an anxiety that you did feel writing the story about you and your sister and about your family.
I mean, I didn't, because I was writing it in Spanish at first in Argentina, and it was always necessarily going to be riddled with mistakes in Spanish. And that was really liberating for me. Like, I chose to do a project that I could at least attempt in Spanish, which is a language I started studying in my 20s. So it is, you know, simple vignettes about childhood, at least in the beginning, in chronological order. And there's, you know, there are other reasons for why they're structured that way, but I knew that it was a distortion. It was inevitably going to be a distortion of what, again, I wrote it as a novel, but it was inevitably going to be a distortion of the facts because the facts were in English and this book was in Spanish, and I really loved that. And I actually began writing an English version to share it with my sister, so she was very much on board, which was very helpful. She actually helped me remember a few things that I had forgotten about her illness. So I didn't feel much anxiety about getting it wrong. I think probably if I had known it would eventually be called a memoir, I would have felt really differently. But
was that a decision for you when now you're deciding to rewrite it in English? And I'm not sure, did the photography come into this version, not the original?
Yes, yeah.
So all those decisions, I mean, what brought that about? And I'm guessing the memoir is that your decision, was a publisher's?
I mean, that also had to do with the photography. So in the original version, it's just these vignettes that are themselves like Polaroid snapshots. So then you have this like headline, which is that white strip on a Polaroid picture, and the main character, Amy, who's based on me, is obsessed with photography as a way of like capturing her sister, especially once she gets sick. So I felt that that inserting actual photographs would be redundant at first. And it was actually my agent who insisted that I put them in because in the transition to English, we had lost this other thing that it had in Spanish of being obviously foreign. So in the Spanish version, you can immediately tell that I'm not from Buenos Aires, although I'm also not a Spanish speaker from somewhere else. Like, you can tell that there's some connection, but that I'm not from there. And of course, that is lost in English. So the idea was to create a little bit of inviting distance to kind of encourage the reader to step forward into this world, and that's why I put the photographs in reverse chronological order, more or less, and I accompanied them with these captions that then form a letter at the end from the older sister from me to my sister. But it became like a more complicated device in English.
By the way, if anyone has questions from the audience, please raise your hand. Okay.
Thank you. That was such a beautiful reading. It's so interesting to hear about Tulsa. And you mentioned celebrity, and Vu, you mentioned the decision to write what is marketed as a memoir in the third person. And one of the striking features of what you read tonight was the collective narrator. And there seems to be a marked avoidance of the first person singular in your work, which somehow seems to me to dovetail with something, the humility of the project of translating.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious to hear you talk or think about how you made those choices and why, and what, you know, considerations of, I guess, point of view.
Yeah. I mean, so that was exactly why I made the decision for the new novel. It begins with this group of people who are no longer individuals, who are just in the service of this greater power. And then at the end of that chapter, the last sentence is in first person singular, and then it breaks. So there's this book is supposedly written by the Spanish translator who's from Buenos Aires, but she writes it in Polish, and then it's translated from Polish into English by her arch nemesis, the American translator, Alexis Archer.
This is so cool.
who inserts all of her footnotes correcting the Argentine author until eventually they fight the duel, and you'll see. But
you also wrote your PhD. You just told me a dissertation on duels.
I'm really obsessed with duels. If anyone knows anything about duels, come and talk to me afterwards. I really like a good duel. I wrote a dissertation about it, but I couldn't find any women's duels, so I wrote one. But in this book, I think it was because I wanted it to be like a photograph, so I wanted it to be kind of from the outside, even though it was, pictures of the narrator, who wasn't quite the narrator. So I think it was a slightly different thing. But maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was subconsciously, still I was afraid of first person.
I don't think of it as fear.
Right.
It seems like something to do with just being constitutionally.
Yeah, right.
There's a humility, it seems.
Yeah.
And connected to that, just to follow up another question you mentioned earlier today, that you're interested in collaborative translation. That also seems to be part of getting away from the sort of first-person driven perspective that's so common in contemporary fiction.
Yeah, I think, so it's something I haven't done much of yet. I'm supposed to do, I did a conversation in photographs with one of my authors, Fede Falco, and we were going to write something together, I think, but then we didn't, but we still could. So I've done also a little bit with a Ukrainian author I worked with on some nonfiction that we kind of we're planning together, writing together. It is something that just really intrigues me, but I also am interested in kind of interpreting, and have started writing some fiction that is almost in the voice of one of the authors I've translated, or this started with that same author, Fede Falco, who wrote this beautiful collection of short stories called A Perfect Cemetery. And when I finished those stories, I just felt bereft, like I needed to continue. But there weren't any more stories there, so I just started writing my own. And even this novel, I was telling Vu earlier about a Polish writer named Witold Gombrowicz, who lived for a long time in Buenos Aires out of necessity. He took a free writer's cruise from Poland in 1939, in the summer of 1939, and then he couldn't go home for a very long time. And I really, immersed myself in his work, and I think this is also, he didn't write that many books. This is almost an extension of that. I just think it's interesting to again, test the limits of authorship and original versus translation, and just the boundaries between self and other. I mean, this book talks a lot about lichens, which are these composite organisms, or these slime molds, which are very difficult for the human imagination to kind of capture, and these mycelial partnerships between trees and fungi, where basically nothing in the forest is an individual. And I think it's good to think about the literary ecosystem in that way, as well as the literary celebrity prize-winning thing. Yeah.
So this isn't a question. I'm so glad I'm here, but I'm doubly glad because I'm reading this book right now. It's on my bedside, called Entangled Life.
It's a wonderful book.
By Merlin Sheldrake.
I love this book.
It's the most amazing book about fungus. And
yeah.
Fungus is a great metaphor for everything, for the absolute interconnectedness of all existence, except it's actually a scientific book.
But it's so beautiful. So if you haven't read Merlin Sheldrake's Entangled Life, it's just gorgeous. Also, the audiobook, which he narrates, is stunning. I've re-listened to it because it's just so beautifully narrated. But he has this really poetic sensibility, even though he is a scientist.
He's like the only scientist in the last 10 years who can write in the way a poet would write.
Yeah. And his brother is Cosmo Sheldrake, and is an experimental musician. So, I don't know, it's a really
I
interesting.
was just wondering who their dad was, because Merlin and Cosmo.
Yeah, I know. Their dad was a scientist, but I don't remember the details of the dad.
Yeah.
But must have been a cool guy. I think John had a question or a comment.
Yes, well, this is sort of following up on what you've been talking about, what you were talking about. So, would you talk a little bit about, because you were translating from languages that are quite dissimilar, so I'm thinking about Spanish and Polish. Spanish and Polish, and really immersing yourself in those worlds, right? The thing that we were talking about earlier, how you see it almost as kind of each text is kind of oceanic experience, and so you're really immersing yourself, and sort of, I think it is a little, it sounds like it's a very real experience, right, as opposed to just solely in your head. So when you talk about like moving between those languages in English, and then also, I was really fascinated when you were talking about, you know, extending, in a sense, or another kind of, because translation doesn't rewrite things, but then this, like extending that process to writing in the style of, like another author. When you mentioned on Prohibition, I'm thinking of, I think it was Freddie Derrick is the famous book. And it's one of those books, I think, you know, there's certain authors when you start to read them, you know, you can almost feel their style taking over. Mm-hmm. You know, and you want to stop reading at a certain point and maybe you can start writing like them, right? And I think this is something that people think of, you know, being the case for authors who are just starting out, right? I mean, you can be a staff author and, you know, read something else and just be really kind of mentor this stuff. So I guess we'd love to just hear you talk about moving between the English, Polish, and Spanish, and then just thinking about that kind of merging of style or drawing out from a text that you really, really love, that you didn't want, you know, you kept saying, but you didn't want to stop translating and reading, and that becoming a kind of another kind of space of possibility for collaboration, collaborative, you know, imagination, creativity.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for those questions and comments. Yeah, I like what you say about how this happens to a lot of people, probably has happened to everyone, that you're in the middle of a project that you're writing and you start reading something and you have to put it down because it's taking over your own style. So that, and you know, I know a lot of people who just like don't read while they're writing a novel or whatever. And I think that I am really intrigued by the idea of taking contamination and turning it into, again, this kind of composite creature that is actually much richer. You know, the lichen becomes, I don't know, maybe I learned this from Merlin's book, an extremophile, I think I did, where it can survive like in space. It can survive in any situation. It can be like inside a huge rock under the ocean, and it still is alive, but only because it's a fungus collaborating with an algae and then these other, you know, bacteria, etc. So I guess, yeah, I like that idea. Of course, it could go horribly, horribly wrong. It could be a kind of Frankenstein thing as well, but that could also be interesting. But I think, I don't know exactly how the language the boundaries between Polish and Spanish and English, I'm not really sure how that, I guess because they're not already in English, I do get to choose the words, so I'm already doing this creative thing, and then I'm just taking it one step further, or several steps further maybe, and I don't feel like I'm, erasing them in any way or writing over them, but I feel like I'm being maybe even more honest about where my subjectivity and how my interpretations are formed. And I think that's really important, again, with the things that I was mentioning earlier about the translator's identity needing to be appreciated, also the translator needing to take responsibility for the choices that they're making, whether they're right or wrong. So I don't know. It's something that I haven't fully figured out. I don't really move between languages very easily when I'm speaking them, but I do like to access texts in other languages kind of constantly.
Maybe I can ask one last question, because the idea of collaboration in my mind immediately suggests like coherence, cohesion, synthesis, but that it makes me think of a line from Flights, which is the narrator says she's drawn to all things spoiled, flawed, defective, broken, to anything that deviates from the norm, that is too small or too big. And it seems to me as much as the idea of collaboration is clearly important to you, it seems like the deviation from that is quite important as well, especially for all the unexpected things that come out of it for you, right?
Yeah. Yes, I'm a deviant. I'm very drawn to smallness, and so these kinds of like linguistic details are really important to me, and I think those are often my subjects too, are just small things. These are small vignettes. I'm writing a book about postcard, like humbler things that sometimes go unnoticed, and I really appreciate them and find them very soothing.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's a good way to end. Thank you so much again for visiting us. Thank you all for being here.